We will not be flying that flag. We'll be flying our national flags because we believe that actually the national flags and the county flag represent gay people and equality across the piece. So we're all united under that banner and not divided under what has become, I would argue, a really quite dodgy and sinister movement.
From corporations to councils, many places are removing the pride flag from their displays, and fewer people want to identify with the parade. Why is that? To discuss this, I am joined by the Deputy Leader of Durham County Council, a reform-led council since the local elections, Darren Grimes, and I'm also joined by Lara Brown, our Commissioning Editor at The Spectator. Darren and Lara, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. Now, sadly, Gareth Roberts, who wrote the cover piece, can't be with us today, but he has written about why the Pride Parade is potentially over. Darren, as the Deputy Leader of Durham's reform-led County Council, you were part of the charge that has removed a pride flag from a council building. So I wanted to get your reaction to Gareth's piece and if this, what's happened in Durham County Council is part of Gareth's argument.
Yeah, I would say it is actually. And, Gareth, I've read his work for a number of years now, and I completely agree with him. This is a man who supported the really laudable aims of equality for homosexual people in this country. And that final frontier, I would argue, was same-sex marriage. Well, guess what? We managed to secure that. We managed to achieve that final frontier of equality. Yet still, as Douglas Murray, another one of your brilliant writers, put it, it's a bit like the equality movement has become St. George in retirement, where, St. George has slain the dragon, and now all he can find to slay are some errant sheep on some hill somewhere. So the battle for equality has been fought and won, and I thank absolutely everybody who did that. But now it seems to me that they're seeking to champion every other new identity, non-binary or whatever pansexual means, a sort of, I assume, not an affliction to kitchenware, and a strong belief actually in the gender cult, which I think actually has harmed and ensured that there is a lack of safeguarding for primarily young gay people or autistic people, studies suggest, who have been swept up by this gender craze and harmed in effect by it too. But as Laura says in her piece, this isn't going away anytime soon. So we are making a stand here on our local authority. We will not be flying that flag. We'll be flying our national flags because we believe that actually the national flags and the county flag represent gay people and equality across the piece. So we're all united under that banner and not divided under what has become, I would argue, a really quite dodgy and sinister movement.
And I want to get into the gender side of things in a second. I also want to pick up on some of the things you said about whether equality has been met. But just could you tell the audience a little bit about who made the decision in the council, how it was it voted on? Was it part of your campaign before that all pride flags are going to be removed? How did that decision come about, and how popular was it within the council?
So there are 65 elected representatives here on the council out of 98. So we have an overwhelming mandate from people. We said that we wouldn't support DEI measures, which I claim to either be, based on the candidate that didn't earn it, DEI, or a really quite racist element of talking about things like unconscious bias and white privilege, which is, by the way, training that I've refused to undertake. So those things were set out during the election campaign, were made clear our stance on those positions. So we believe ultimately that we have a mandate to do this. I have had nothing but support from members of our community, but I'm afraid there has been vocal activists elsewhere, whether they be in the press, whether they be in other political parties, especially the Liberal Democrats, which care more about flags than they do the people's priorities. And I've spent the last week talking about nothing other than flags. I'm to be quite frank, utterly sick and amazed, astonished by the nature at which people have a laser-like focus on identity or identitarian politics over actually delivery, you know?
And Lara, I want to bring you in here because you wrote a sidebar to accompany the cover piece about why a lot of this is to do with the trans movement. Darren has said that actually in part is the trans movement that was quite detrimental to the Pride parade in terms of it getting so out of hand. I wondered how much you put it towards the trans movement that has caused Pride to sort of boil over, and maybe just explain a little bit about your argument about why, whilst we might think that gender wars are over, perhaps they're not.
So I think there's a few things here. I think Pride days were numbered before gender ideology really got hold. The difficulty for Pride, I mean, London Pride dates 1972, and it spends 40 years doing really good work fighting things that are harmful to the gay community, like Section 28 and the prohibition on gay marriage. And then they get this big win in 2013. And you have all of these charities that are very well funded, with a lot of people working for them full time, who think, oh no, it's great we've won, but I want to go to work tomorrow and do something. So the trans pivot, I think, is a function of that industrial complex. And Simon Fanshawe is very interesting on this. He left Stonewall after the gay marriage win because he felt that, equality had been achieved and others didn't. But I don't think it's just trans. We've seen a massive pivot in what is being shown at Pride. Pride has become somewhere you wouldn't really want to take a child. There's a lot of celebrations of violent sex, for example. Polyamory has been really sort of sledgehammered into Pride, which often feels, quite different to the fight for men to be able to marry men and enjoy the sort of sanctity of marriage. And, they have sort of lost a real purpose. But trans has been where the complete contradictions coalesce. And Gareth Roberts writes about this really well in his piece. How can we simultaneously be fighting for the right of same-sex attracted people to be with each other, and then also believing that sex isn't real? And a huge part of the gender movement has been a fight by predominantly heterosexual men to be accepted into lesbian spaces because they identify as women. So there is this massive rights conflict, and there's also the safeguarding conflict. We know from the Cass review that a lot of the children identifying as transgender and then being sent on potentially very harmful pathways like puberty blockers, like interventions like surgery and hormones, are either gay or autistic. Those two things correlate really, really highly. So as Darren says, this ideology is something that's harmed the movement. The point of my piece is it's sort of cautionary tale, basically. A lot of people are celebrating the Supreme Court win. I think it was a really, really good, clear watermark decision. I think the Equality Act already was pretty clear, but we now have the Supreme Court saying that, which is very helpful. But that doesn't mean that these groups are going to pack up and go home in the same way that Stonewall didn't pack up and go home in 2013. They're going to keep pushing. So my piece tries to document some of the instances of, what that push will look like, so we can anticipate it. There's going to be a fight about what biological sex means. When I talk to people who aren't following this closely, they think I sound completely crazy because it's so obvious. But they thought about what woman means. They're going to fight about biological sex. People like India Willoughby and Dr. Helen Weberly have already started that. There's probably going to be an attempt to go to the ECHR. They have very little legal ground. I've spoken to a lot of lawyers on this, and they don't think there's much there. But they're going to try and argue that a 2004 ECHR judgment called Goodwin necessitates the right to change sex and access opposite gender spaces, opposite sex spaces. So there's going to be that legal fight. And then there's going to be a campaign of misinformation. Stonewall are already telling employers that they don't have to provide single-sex spaces, that it's up to them to interpret the law how they want. We're having, it's currently, I think, quite difficult if you're a small company who is not well informed about the law, with a not very good legal team, to wade through the guidance. We've now finally had something from the Human Rights Commission, and that's really good. But people are going to fall foul of believing activist guidance to be in good faith. So this isn't over yet. And I think the sort of marching on of Pride is not helping anyone. And it's certainly no longer something that really benefits same-sex attracted people, I don't think.
Darren, what do you make of the idea that this gender ideology movement isn't over yet? Because you were one of the first outspoken gay men to deal with would you say, violence, a lot of abuse on Twitter and in public. I think I read somewhere that you were banned from a gay bar. Is that right?
Absolutely correct. Yeah. I would argue, going back to my experience as a child, I was driven to go out and use my limited access to funds to purchase and donate to Stonewall. I purchased one of the iconic red mugs, "Some people are gay, get over it," and I thought and believed in that entirely. But Lara is absolutely correct to say that actually effectively what we have here are vested interests who say, well, as long as we keep expanding the definition of when and what the goalposts are for equality being achieved, we can continue to receive vast sums, whether it be from, hilariously, from US aid, which of course Trump slashed, or, the funding for new groups that have been created over the last few years. It's moved so far away from what were really laudable aims of allowing a society to be fermented in which there would be no child such as I who grew up believing that actually if you are gay, that your life would be so impacted that the only thing that is possibly available to you is either through self-harm or some other really awful, whether that be alcohol dependency, drug dependency, whatever it might be. And of course, no one is suggesting, I've had it put to me by Lib Dems within this very council that, I am anti-gay. I'm nothing, I'm far from it. I'm nothing but a fervent supporter in what was once the very laudable aim and objective of equality. But I just want to be as boring as everybody else. Yeah. I just want to be accepted and part of society. I don't want to stand out like a sore thumb within that society and constantly say me, me, me. And that's what this movement has become and morphed into. And I'm afraid that far too often the Conservative Party allowed itself to become a wing of that movement. Let's not forget that Penny Mordaunt, who was a serious contender for the leadership of the Conservative Party at one point, actually stood up at the dispatch box and said trans men are men and trans women are women. Well, I don't agree with that, because ultimately if biological sex doesn't exist, then guess what? Sexuality doesn't exist either. So you lose the rights that have been long fought for and hardly achieved not that long ago. 10 years, 2013 was same-sex marriage. So all of these battles, they've been hard won. Let's not, I think, allow it to become a free-for-all for those who have vested interests and want to keep their pockets lined.
Has equality really been achieved for gay men specifically? Lots of my gay friends would say to me, I wouldn't walk down the street and hold my boyfriend's hand for fear of getting beaten up.
Well, I wouldn't do that anyway, because I just think it's distasteful to do it, to be honest. I would say that about straight people as well. I don't like public displays of affection. They call it PDAs, don't they?
Hand-holding seems a little bit...
I'm not convinced that that's fine if someone were to attack someone for doing that on the streets. But I think examples of genuine homophobic abuse, violence is very rare in this country. But, I wouldn't personally do it myself anyway. So I'm not sure I would put that as a marker of equality being achieved.
Maybe we'll start an anti-PDA parade instead. Lara, I wanted to ask you a bit about the politics behind Pride as well, especially with the gender critical movement tying in. Obviously, the Conservatives are the ones that allowed all of this really pervasive trans ideology to happen under their watch, as Darren said. Which political party would you most trust to handle this situation? Is it Reform? And then, Darren, I'd love to hear from you a little bit about where Reform stands on this topic as well.
Darren is right. A lot of the worst excesses of this happened under the Conservatives. We almost reached a point under Theresa May where we would have had de facto self-ID laws, and that is quite scary. And that would have meant that things like rape crisis centres or lesbian groups wouldn't have been able to function. There is no point shying away from that. I think there's 2 points to make here. that point in history around 2017, when a lot of gender ideology really gained speed and traction, was one with almost no political opposition. There was no one in Parliament pushing against Theresa May. The Labour Party wanted to do things faster. Jeremy Corbyn committed in his manifesto to self-ID. The Lib Dems are absolutely crazy on this issue, and obviously there was no reform in Parliament. I think this was a question of society collectively waking up, or to how bad things had got. And there's a few women that you have to credit with doing that early. The Tory party is now led by one of those women. Kemi Badenoch met survivors. She spoke to Kira Bell, who had a case in the Supreme Court after she received double mastectomy very, very young, and was put on puberty blockers before she was really old enough to consent. And she undid a lot of the worst excesses. And that was progress that happened under the Conservatives. The Conservatives went into the last election committing to clarify the Equality Act, which now doesn't need doing because of the Supreme Court, but it would have saved a very expensive court case from happening and saved a lot of court time being wasted. They rode things back. A lot of quite technical but really important things happened. Gender questioning guidance for schools has come out. We're waiting for Labour to make that statutory, but that gives teachers a sense of how to safeguard children who believe they're transgender. We also got the Cash Review commissioned, and the single most important thing to happen for the last 20 years in this gender debate is the Cash Review, and we saw that happen because a Conservative government did it. So I think the Conservatives can be trusted on this. And if anyone can be trusted on this, it's Kemi Badenoch. Because Kemi was pushing on it before it was, when it was highly controversial and when it could lose you your career. That's not to say that reform can't be. They've been very clear on this. I think the flag policy is a good policy. I like them on it. But I think this isn't an area with much clear water. The people I'm worried about are Labour and the Lib Dems.
So I would say, actually, I believe off the top of my head that Kemi Badenoch was elected in Saffron Walden in 2017, actually, in that 2017 election. If you consider that from 2017 to 2024, that 7-year period, I agree Kemi Badenoch has herself been surrounded by people that I would consider very good friends who are of the same view as her, that actually biological sex is immutable, and that comes with obviously protections for women and single-sex spaces. I've no doubt that she's been a champion on that. But can you say that for the rest of her party? I bet you if you go through the archives, Robert Jenrick has probably said some supportive things about the trans movement since 2010. So I'm not convinced that they are, at the forefront of this battle. They were found wanton many times on this issue. I was, as you say, barred from gay clubs, but I was also condemned online by the LGB Tories, or whatever they call themselves these days. That is the gay faction of the Conservative Party. So I, as a then member of the Conservative Party, was left feeling that I was some kind of, swivel-eyed bigot for believing that actually sex is immutable. So the Conservative Party have a lot to answer for and apologise for on that and so much else. The betrayal was vast and deep, and I don't think people are going to forget that all too often. So I would say that Reform's stance on this is quite simple. They believe that sexuality is the least interesting thing about you, or it ought to be the least interesting thing about a person. Wear what you want, call yourself whatever you want, but don't assume that you can come along and dictate what have been very hard fought for rights for women and the protection of girls. I've lived a life where I've had to know a thing or two about the protection of vulnerable women, very sadly. And I would never, ever, with all of my heart, want to see what are the most vulnerable positions a woman could be placed into, put in jeopardy because some blue-head, well, I was about to use some colourful language there, more colourful than their hair.
Anything on Spectator TV.
Some blue-haired, new age, new wave activist coming along to say that actually they should be allowed in those changing rooms and all the rest of it. To me, it's just been common sense all along, and I've never shied away from saying that. Maybe in 2015, You know, I probably as a student would have assumed that there were fewer things to this movement, and there are quite clearly as we understand it today. I've probably been on a little journey myself, but it didn't take me quite as long as it's sadly taken many frontline politicians.
I have one last question for you, Darren, about Reform's interesting position that they're going to lift the two-child benefit cap, because Feroze is saying he wants everyone to have more children. So can we assume that that applies to gay couples as well?
Well, on that particular policy, I mean, there are precious few gay couples that are raising children. To be honest with you, the specifics of that question I haven't even considered. But I would argue that Reform's policies, whether that be on marriage, tax breaks, are all part of a same package that ultimately wants people to have more children, to raise more families, because ultimately we are on the precipice of a serious population decline. And if we don't reverse that trend, well, you know, you can kiss goodbye to the demographic time bomb. It won't be that. It'll be an explosion. It will have gone off like you wouldn't believe. And then that has profound impacts on society and the way in which we can actually maintain welfare and all the rest of it. So having more families, I'm all for more babies. Britain needs to go out and have more babies. And any ways in which we can achieve that should be explored.
Darren and Lara, great to have you on Spectator TV.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.